Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American 1%. The U.S. wars are not in the news. The presidential candidates are a distraction, while the U.S. government continues to kill people around the world. And the U.S. government will continue to do so, whether a Republican or Democrat is elected president, unless we stop them. While the U.S. media bombard us with the presidential candidates, the Obama administration is literally bombarding and killing people around the world, and managing to keep us largely unaware of it. Most Americans don't realize that President Obama has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than President Bush, and is today sending U.S. troops into no less than 3/4 of the countries in the world. There are more than 70,000 of these special operation forces, and they report only to the President's National Security Council. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Meanwhile, the President's continuing drone assassinations, the New York Times says that he chooses the targets himself, have already killed thousands of people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. In addition to conducting wars throughout the Mideast, the Obama administration is acting with belligerence towards China and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, which has already killed more people than Israel killed, with U.S. permission, in Gaza in 2014. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, but America's worldwide violence is creating terrorists, not defeating them. Worse, the U.S. is today covertly cooperating with those terrorists, the people who committed 9/11, notably in Syria. The U.S. created modern jihadism 40 years ago, during the Carter administration, when the U.S. collected the most fanatic Islamists it could find and sent them into Afghanistan in the most expensive CIA operation in history, and that was before the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, specifically to harass the Russians and, quote, give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own, as President Carter's national security advisor said. Although control of Mideast energy resources was the real reason, the Bush and Obama administrations launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people with the propagandistic excuse that they were fighting terrorism. But after all, what is that? There are in fact official definitions of terrorism in U.S. and British law and in U.S. Army manuals, all about the same. Terrorism is defined as, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature, through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations fall under the definition of terrorism. In fact, state-directed international terrorism in the technical sense of U.S. and British law. For exactly that reason, the official definitions are unusable by our government. They fail to make a crucial distinction. The concept of terrorism must somehow be crafted to include foreigners' terrorism against us while excluding our terrorism against them, which is often far more extreme. To devise such a definition is a challenging task. So it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says, quote, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's really an easy way. Stop participating in it. He's pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. Obama has killed literally thousands of people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. The New York Times says that Obama chooses the targets himself from lists prepared by the CIA, and his drone assassinations continue today. 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war because Americans demanded it. By 1978, polls showed that 72% of the U.S. population regarded the war in Vietnam as not a mistake, but as fundamentally wrong and immoral. As in Southeast Asia then, so now in Southwest Asia. The U.S. must end its criminal war. We must demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, 1, end the drone assassinations, 2, bring all U.S. troops and mercenaries home, 3, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world. No other country has more than 12. 4, end the provocations of Russia and Ukraine and China in the South China Sea. 5, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons. And 6, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Kurds to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows. "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much of it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, and we'll begin with Ron Szoke.
Yes, I'll talk about a few instances of what I call twist and spin, the American propaganda efforts and to some extent Israeli propaganda efforts to characterize what's going on in the Middle Eastern quagmire. But are we allowed to say that Donald Trump got schlonged in Iowa yesterday? Or, well, maybe not. So the other note for today is that Punxsutawney Phil, the official groundhog in some eyes, didn't see a shadow, and so that means, according to folklore, we are in for an early spring and not the 6 more weeks of winter that is supposed to happen if he does see his shadow. Exclusive from Reuters, U.S. budget plan includes over $13 billion for new submarines, by Andrei Shalai. Washington, the Pentagon's next 5-year budget proposal seeks over $13 billion in funding for a new submarine to carry nuclear ballistic missiles, plus orders for more Boeing Company and Lockheed Martin Corporation fighter jets, according to sources familiar with the plans. The plan also shifts the Navy's strategy for a new carrier-based unmanned drone to focus more on intelligence gathering and refueling than combat strike missions, said the sources, who were not authorized to discuss it publicly before the budget's release. U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter plans to map out his spending priorities for the $583 billion 2017 defense budget on Tuesday, ahead of the official budget release on February 9th. The Pentagon's plan will also underscore the need to fund all 3 legs of the U.S. strategic deterrent triad, a new Air Force bomber, which we've mentioned here several times before, a long-range heavy bomber carrying tons of bombs and with a 8 to 10,000 mile operating range. A replacement for the Ohio-class submarines that carry nuclear weapons and new nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles, said one of the sources. So the Navy's proposed fiscal 2017 budget will fund procurement of materials for the new submarines that take a long time to acquire, with funding for construction of the first full new submarine to follow in fiscal 2021, and so on. So whenever human services are the question, we keep hearing federal deficit. There's no money for that, but there are apparently going to be billions upon billions available for more war machines and killing. Second point, Pentagon won't say how many troops are fighting ISIS. Daily Beast, February 1st, Nancy Youssef and Shane Harris say officially there are now 3,650 U.S. troops fighting ISIS in Iraq. The real number of Americans involved in the war is closer to 6,000. In a war against the self-proclaimed Islamic State, there are two ways to count the number of U.S. boots on the ground. There's the one that officials admit to, and then there's the ground truth. Officially, there are now 3,650 U.S. troops in Iraq. They're primarily to help train the Iraqi National Army, but in reality, there are already 4,450 U.S. troops in Iraq, plus another nearly 7,000 contractors supporting the American government's operations. That includes almost 1,100 U.S. citizens working as military contractors, according to the latest Defense Department statistics. And of course, that's another word for what most people would call mercenaries. Mm-hmm. In other words, the total number of forces that the Pentagon and Obama administration officials frequently cite in public are wrong. They're short thousands of contractors and about 800 troops. These forces are often assigned to specialized units or tasked with supporting troops on the front line. Those short-term support troops could include security personnel or others maintaining base services. The official tally is comprised almost entirely of troops serving on the front line alongside Iraqi forces. We created a variety of categories of troops, the official explained. So that's how they avoid saying how many American personnel are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. They simply say, well, there are much fewer combat troops, and those people are not officially called combat troops. They're called support and training troops, but they're fighting and getting killed anyway. Next point. Contractor kidnappings and the perils of privatized wars. Tim Sherrock in The Nation, more than 3,700 contractors died in the global battlefield between 2001 and 2015. This deadly and secrecy-shrouded game of crony capitalism, he calls it. In other words, it's called crony capitalism because these the Pentagon has certain favored contractors that it keeps going back to for these secret operations. Most of the contractor deaths, 3,259 of them, took place in Iraq and Afghanistan about equally, where the United States has been at war for most of the past decade. Large numbers of contractors also lost their lives in Kuwait, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. In comparison, over 6,800 U.S. soldiers were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2001 and 2015. DynCorp International, the single largest U.S. contractor in Afghanistan and a major contractor in Iraq, lost 169 people. The third highest total, 151, were working for KBR Incorporated, the former subsidiary of Halliburton that became notorious after winning Army logistics contracts in Iraq due to its close ties with former Vice President Dick Cheney. Nearly all of that total, 140, were employed by KBR's subsidiary, Service Employees International. It was a major provider to KBR of truck drivers, hundreds of whom were attacked during the early stages of the Iraq War. So that's where the money is going. Military spending, past, present, and future wars, now consumes over half the federal budget, according to my sources, but we're hearing very little about that. in terms of the national deficit and national debt. All we hear about is that we don't have money for human services, Social Security, aid to poor children, medical services, and so on. Next point, rushing from point to point here. Israel says it will seize West Bank land, demolishes EU structures, European Union. Jerusalem, from Reuters, Israel confirmed on Thursday, that's of last week, it was planning to appropriate a large tract of fertile land in the occupied West Bank, close to Jordan, a move likely to exacerbate tensions with Western allies and already drawing international condemnation. In an email sent to Reuters, a unit of Israel's defense ministry said the political decisions to seize the territory had been taken and the lands are in the final stages of being declared state lands. The appropriation covers 380 acres of Jordan Valley, close to Jericho, an area where Israel already has many settlement farms built on land Palestinians seek for a state. It is the largest land seizure since August of 2014. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon denounced the move, and Palestinian officials said they would push for a resolution at the United Nations against Israel's settlement policies. So this should be read in conjunction, I suppose, with something that actually appeared in the local daily. Road project puts Israel and the EU in opposition. A narrow country road outside Jerusalem has been turned into a new battleground between Israel and the European Union, deepening a dispute between the allies over Israeli settlement construction in the West Bank. The EU is financing the paving of a dirt road by Palestinians as a part of a broader effort to help them develop the local economy on the way to eventual independence. Israel, however, says the roadwork is illegal because it was done without Israeli permits and has ordered it to stop. So the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, made a statement last week about the continuing Palestinian-Israeli conflict. The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called Israeli criticism of attacks on its settlement policy unsustainable in an opinion piece published Sunday by the New York Times. Doubling down on comments earlier in the week that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said encouraged terrorism. In a piece entitled "Don't Shoot the Messenger, Israel," Ban reiterates many of his earlier comments to the Security Council on Tuesday, calling Israeli settlement activity an affront to the Palestinian people, adding that it is human nature to resist occupation. He also called for a freeze on settlement activity, which most of the international community views as illegal or illegitimate. Criticism of the United Nations or attacks on me come with the territory, Ban said, but when the heartfelt concerns about short-sighted or morally damaging policies emanate from so many sources, including Israel's closest friends, it cannot be sustainable to keep lashing out at every well-intentioned critics. But, of course, that's what's going on. The criticism, Ban's criticism, was sparked by Israel's recent approval of 150 new homes in settlements in the West Bank. In the opinion piece, Ban also pointed out that last month Israel declared 370 acres in the West Bank state land, which he said typically leads to exclusive settler use. The response from Israel was the usual talk about anti-Semitism and Holocaust and all of that. Maybe I mentioned last week the Israeli Defense Force admits spraying herbicides inside the Gaza Strip. The Army says aerial spraying was meant to enable security operations. Palestinian farmers say hundreds of acres of crops were damaged or destroyed. The Palestinian Agricultural Ministry officials told one news source that farmers said the Israeli planes had been spraying their agricultural lands adjacent to the border fence for several days straight. Spinach, pea, parsley, and bean crops were reportedly destroyed around the Al-Qatar area in eastern Yan Kouns and the Wadi el-Sakla area in central Gaza, according to the report. So, an unfortunate series of incidents and events. Finally, one slightly encouraging, perhaps, or amusing note. Trained Eagles destroys drone in Dutch police video. The Dutch National Police released a video that shows huge birds of prey flying through the air and grabbing small consumer drones out of the sky. For hundreds of years, the skies over Asia, people have used eagles to hunt down prey with deadly results. The tradition has been in decline for decades, but now the bird's keen insight, powerful talons, and lethal hunting instincts are being used to take out a new kind of 21st century vermin, drones. The animal versus machine moment is brought to you by Guard from Above, which describes itself as the world's first company specialized in training birds of prey to intercept hostile drones. So these are small consumer style drones, I assume, and they're not tackling the bigger weaponized drones that are used by the USA and of course will eventually and increasingly be used by all of our competitors and enemies. So I'll close with that note. Thank you.
The dark side of the Dutch Eagles is the fact that that's the story that's been sent around about the attacks on the drones. But the reason the Dutch are doing it is that they are heeding the American requirement to go to Syria and bomb. The Dutch Air Force, believe it or not, the Dutch Air Force will be attacking Syria, and they want to keep a system to deal with the threat of drones. They decided on eagles. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram.
Yeah, Carl, I want to comment on that. That was an article I read today about the Netherlands. They're being pressured now by the EU alliance, the U.S., NATO, to begin bombing ISIS. Yeah, exactly. And this is getting very serious. But I won't go into that since I only briefed it. Excuse me. But it's in relation to what Ron was talking about. Okay, on Asia. Yesterday there was an article, South Korea joins the U.S.-Japan intelligence link. This is by Ben McGrath. And he says that South Korea has taken a step toward joining the U.S. anti-ballistic missile system in the Asia-Pacific region. Seoul will set up a data link allowing its military to share information with not only the U.S., but also Japan. The agreement is part of a Washington-encouraged cooling of tensions between Seoul and Tokyo that is now being utilized to further align the U.S. allies in war preparations against China. So there's not much cooling down there. Then, today, Peter Simons, or Simmons, I think it's Simons, article, pressure mounts on Australian government to challenge China in the South China Sea. He said last weekend's incursion by the U.S. Navy, I mean this was our provocation just last week with another one, within the 12 nautical mile territorial limit of Chinese administered Triton Island has increased the pressure on the Australian government to follow suit. The U.S. clearly wants an Australian military intrusion in the South China Sea so as to give the appearance of international unity to its provocations against China. And accordingly, Rupert Murdoch's Australian, that must be his magazine or a blog, I'm not sure, is beating the drum for an Australian military intervention, a freedom of navigation operation. Currently, operation is already under active discussion in government and military circles in Canberra. Now, like the U.S., which has never ratified the UN Convention on the law of the sea, or I call it UNCLOS, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. The Australian government's invocations of international legality are completely hypocritical. This is according to Peter Simons. He says that while criticizing China for not accepting adjudication by an international tribunal in The Hague, Canberra took precisely that stance in 2002, when it refused to recognize the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction in its maritime boundary dispute with East Timor. Instead, the Australian government brazenly bullied the small, impoverished state into an agreement that ensured that Australian control of the lion's share of the Timor Sea oil and gas. So I think we know what that's all about and where we're headed. And you know, I have been very, let's say, trying to be upbeat or positive about these other nations, how long and how far they will go, given that they do have a lot of business interests with China. And we know that China is attempting to build infrastructure, or rather institutions, what we call Eastern or Asian institutions, to counteract Western institutions such as the AIIB, the Asian not the Asian Development Bank, that's one they're counteracting. I should be careful, my former employer. Yeah, there goes my pension. Various different organizations like the IMF, et cetera, et cetera. So, but this is positive because I can see these nations going along with the U.S. because it's necessary, because we're giving them a lot of money building up their military, Japan, et cetera. But I'm also seeing you have the fall and the problems with the Chinese yuan. If they have to limit their, what is the word I want to use, devalue their currency. We have George Soros and his cronies out there going after China in regards to the derivatives and the, what do we call, the hedge fund, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what happened in Thailand. I mean, they're kind of like wolves. When they see weakness anywhere, they go in for the kill. And the one thing I've also noted that in China right now, you have as many as 100,000 people being laid off from the steel companies. China has been one of the major suppliers of steel in the world. We have the same problem here. So what's happening is that they're now really suffering from economic instability, specifically within the manufacturing industry. And that's the one thing they don't want. And what does a nation do when they have economic or when they have domestic turmoil? They look for an enemy outside their territory. And so China has put up with our provocations, and they've really kept their cool about it. But I'm wondering how long they will keep their cool. They're already beginning to, I don't want to use the word foment, turmoil related to U.S. provocations amongst their people, but from what I understand, some of their newspapers, they are doing just that, rightfully so. But it doesn't serve any purpose other than to create more turmoil worldwide. But my criticism is to our provocations, and that this is exactly what we've been attempting to do. We have created so many problems in the South China Sea, around the world, on the border of the Ukraine. Look what we've done to Russia. So we are really facing a real hurdle, real turmoil, and the potential for nuclear war. I think we have to face that reality. And added to that, Carl, you mentioned it last week, and I did see an article referring to the new AUMF that has gone to Congress, that is bypassing Congress, that will give President Obama and further presidents down the road unlimited powers to declare war, which is totally contrary to the U.S. Constitution. And while we know we haven't been following going to Congress for war powers for I don't know how many years now, at least 15, but I think it goes back to the Vietnam War, to the Korean War. we're doing this now to such a degree that we are really propping up the presidential administration in such a way that we're pretty much demolishing our Constitution. And this information is actually coming from JAG lawyer, meaning, of course, he's an ex-U.S. Army major and a former judge advocate general, Todd Pierce. He's also an historian. It's coming from William Blum, who was a former U.S., they're always former, U.S. Foreign Service officer and historian. They have really, really significant concerns now about how we are just pushing Congress totally out of the picture and giving complete authority, if we haven't already, to the president. So I think we're in a very serious situation now, people. We've been saying this now for quite a few years, but it just keeps getting worse.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have been joined by our wide-ranging colleague, Michael Bai.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you very much, Carl. We still don't know exactly what went on at Cologne's Central Station on the New Year's Eve night. Police have recorded 379 allegations of violence, 40% of them sexual assaults, with 2 reports of rape. They've identified 31 suspects who include at least 2 Germans, a Serb, an American, and 18 asylum seekers from the Middle East and North Africa. That's all we know for sure. But the public still hasn't quite recovered from the headlines saying that a crowd of 1,000 refugees had mobbed German women.
Yes.
Since then, some of us have been searching for a source of whose testimony we can trust. The police, whose local chief was fired on Friday, aren't exactly helping. An officer claimed a man tore up the papers identifying him as an asylum seeker in front of a policeman, shouting, "You can't do anything to me. I can get a new one tomorrow." The story went viral. 4 days later, it turned out that it couldn't have been an asylum seeker's papers because these are plastic cards and can't be torn. So it's just one of these several examples that highlight a hysterical mood that's making a monster of what is already a nightmare. 1 million migrants arriving in Germany in 2015. The Paris attacks, the far-right parties, Pegida and AfD growing in some ways. As tensions over immigration increased, it seemed everyone was waiting for a major incident. For the last 7 months, every little pinch-up in a refugee camp has been used. An attempt to create a horror story about violence in the other culture. However, despite the propaganda, Germans' Willkommenskultur, or literally translated, welcome culture, survived largely unscathed, caring for refugees and teaching them freedom and democracy.
That's very impressive indeed.
It's important, yeah.
The fact that that attitude maintains in the face of what you rightly characterize, I think, as hysteria. You're watching Aware on the Air. What we'll do now is go back around on the panel with some questions about the things that have been said so far. And I begin with a comment on Ron's observations about $13 billion for new submarines that the Obama administration is proposing. In fact, this is part of a 2017 defense budget to Congress that is going out this week. While we're talking about Donald Trump, the Obama administration is actually preparing an account of a huge military buildup, including another $3.4 billion. I mean, billion now is walk around money for these people. Another $3.4 billion to position American heavy weapons and armor, along with several thousand troops, in NATO's Central and Eastern European countries, the very countries that, in some sense, were the NATO involvement with which was the precipitating cause of the American attack on a weakened Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. what the U.S. is doing, what the Obama administration is planning here, is an American armor brigade on the Russian border. The military planning of the U.S., as Ron suggests, is bound up with this amazing attack in preparation on Russia. Do you think that's the primary job of this new military budget, Ron?
Well, you're asking me to read their ultimate motives and intentions, and I can't really do that, but I'm deeply suspicious. It looks as if, not only to me, but to some other people, that we're preparing for a move against Russia. And the cover story, of course, will be we must free the people of Ukraine and those two easternmost provinces that are now effectively occupied by Russia.
Will, other comments from the panel on that?
Yeah, effectively occupied by Russia. Are those people crying out for assistance from the West?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I am actually more concerned about a first strike on the Ukraine than I am about a first strike on China. But I am very concerned about what's happening now in the South China Sea, given the weakness of the Chinese economy currently. And while I haven't been too concerned about that previously, when I see what I call the war hawks going after them financially as well as militarily, and when I understand their concerns for economic stability, you know, we always talk about, oh, well, they don't have the right to vote, we have the right to vote. And I'm sitting here thinking, yeah, well, you know what? Their people don't have the right to vote, but they will rise up in masses when things go bad, where we are under the assumption that the electoral process is going to save us. So good luck on that one, people. Let's hope for the best.
Do you see at work there the classic strategy of whenever there's trouble domestically, at home, you wag the dog and,
Right.
and then start pointing out what a dangerous world it is out there, and how we have to unify in opposition
Right.
to these foreign devils.
Well, of course, but China doesn't have to wag the dog. We're there with our military, our battleships, our incursions beyond the 12-mile limit. I mean, it's been going on, and they actually initially were trying to keep it quiet. They weren't letting their people find out about it. I think since then that has changed, because as they see the economic problems taking rise, and as I said, the one thing they're concerned about is economic stability. I shouldn't say economic, domestic stability. Instability is their worst fear. And so they do everything they can to maintain stability. And if things get out of hand, then we're the perfect enemy out there. I mean, we are the enemy. So there's no propaganda necessary. So there it is. And that's why it's so dangerous. I wanted to comment on something that Michael said, and I think that I'm glad you brought that up, because I had been hearing a lot about the stabbing of a Swedish volunteer woman and how it was done by a refugee. And I'm getting a lot of this and the attacks on women, but it's coming from RT. And and RT is made, you know, they have a lot of different nationalities, a lot of the RT programming. And I thought, why am I not hearing this from the mainstream media? Well, that's because, from what I see, our mainstream media is focused on domestic and on elections and what Donald Trump had to say. So maybe I've missed it. But I'm a little concerned because I'm not getting the take on it that, Michael, you have given us. But I'm thinking, why all of this, what is the word, inflaming about the migrants that RT is doing in Europe, in different parts of Europe. One was where they show a migrant hitting a woman because she tried to stop him from pickpocketing someone. But we're talking about isolated individual cases that they're hyping up. And all I can see it is propaganda against the migrants and against immigration. And so I'm assuming this is coming from a European point of view because they are being flooded with refugees. They are ill prepared to, I mean, remember, they've got like thousands and thousands of refugees just suddenly coming into the nation. And they're so ill prepared for it, given their own economic problems and turmoil. It's certainly understandable, but it's also very frightening what's happening. So I'm glad you raised the issue, and I like the perspective that you have on it, and I wonder where you got that.
So, yeah. It's
Because RT has just been presenting a lot of what I call inflammatory coverage of it without going into enough of the detail, or at least not that I have caught.
There is some indication, isn't there, Michael, that the German government in general is a little unhappy with the U.S. provocations and economic dislocations for Russia. And I note that the leader of the Bavarian state is off to talk to Putin in a way that indicates that he's at odds with Merkel. That there are strains within the German government about how subservient they're going to be towards American policy, and that even people such as this Bavarian leader is saying, you know, we need to do a better deal with Putin, we need to do a better deal with Russia. Germany's economy is in fact far more affected by the American insistence that the Russians be annoyed than anybody else's is, and they seem not very happy with it.
That's very correct. And these strains are not only regarding Germany's East European policies, but also regarding the refugee policies that Merkel has enacted. So there's widespread, there are widespread concerns in Merkel's own party, as well as in the Social Democratic Party, which is even more left-oriented, against accepting your refugees and not setting an upper limit. But still,
And all this is sort of under the American aegis, the American umbrella of policy towards Russia, huh?
Yes, yes.
Well, what bothers me so much is that everybody gets upset over the refugees. Why don't we just stop causing refugees? But it's up to the European governments to stop supporting us from bringing about all the refugees that all the bombing has.
The only problem, and that certainly would be very good at it, the only problem is as Michael pointed out, there are a million of these refugees right now, and they are displaced people, as we once said, and the question is what then is to be done here?
Right, but more are going to come.
Yep.
More are going to come. With all of that we're talking about here, there will be more. So, yeah, it's, I think you need to stop what we call stop the bleeding first, okay? And then you go in and you remove the bullet, okay? That's putting it simply.
You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Ron. You have questions or comments you want to raise?
Nothing else at the moment. You raised the question about the definition of terrorism. Here's a book I came across some time ago, actually. Terrorism, How the West Can Win, edited by Benjamin Netanyahu, which appeared in 1986. Here's his official definition of terrorism. A formal definition, the one adopted in Jerusalem in 1979. This is all in italics. Terrorism is the deliberate and systematic murder, maiming, and menacing of the innocent to inspire fear for political ends. Notice that there are many terms in this that are subject to interpretation and the imputation of motives and intentions. Again, whether you consider some act as one of terrorism or not depends on the assumptions and baggage that you bring to the judgment. Terrorism is the deliberate, how do we'll judge whether it's deliberate or accidental. Systematic, well, maybe it's systematic, maybe it's not. Maiming and menacing, whether something is menacing is again a subjective judgment. Of the innocent, and well, who's innocent and who's not can lead to a lot of discussion. To inspire fear for political ends. So two elements in that. It's intended to inspire fear, and again, there's no way of verifying what the intention was. And for political ends, well, was it or was it not for political ends? Again, that will depend on the judgment of the observer. So Netanyahu says this distinction is no mere quibble, but it lies at the heart of the problem, for without a clear understanding of terrorism, the problem cannot be tackled. And it seems to me he has not provided one there, so it's still a problem.
And that has the problem that even if you can solve those quandaries about intention, which I don't think perhaps they're as serious as you do, Ron, but even if you can solve those problems, you haven't solved the basic problem of showing that terrorism is produced only by Arabs and not by Israelis, only by Arabs and not by Jews, which of course is got to be part of the problem. If you start talking about Israeli terrorism towards Palestinians, you've lost the game, and that's not a game he wants to lose.
Perennial problem, rigging the definition so it applies to certain people and not to others who seem to be doing the same things in all behavioral respects.
But you notice how easily that seems to be elided in our political discussion and news discussions here. I mean, nobody turns a hair when the U.S. says, well, we're fighting terrorism. And we are killing people throughout the Middle East in order to stop terrorism. And people say, well, yes, that's right. Terrorism's a terrible thing. Look at 9/11, and it has to be stopped. So it works if you can cover over this, the definitional problems that arise when you realize that both sides, if you like, are doing the same thing.
I have a problem with philosophical discussions over blowing off children's heads and arms and killing civilians, the old females, children, you know, as Israel has done to so many Palestinians, unarmed people, devastation. I just can't see the need for a philosophical discussion as to whether or not that is terrorism. To me, it's pretty obvious. So, you know, I have a problem with that. To me, terrorism is pretty bloody obvious who's been committing it, and but I'm not sure that using terrorism to fight terrorism is reasonable. In fact, that's the problem. Even we were talking about the Netherlands. They even this summer, as of this summer, were saying that they felt that a diplomat, even though they had a lot of F-16s. 4 F-16s or 4, what did I read here about the Netherlands? They had, sorry, I've lost the article. Bottom line, they've had military there. They've been bombing in Iraq, but they were holding back on Syria because they felt that diplomacy was probably the answer. Well, some of that has now changed as of December of this year. And what's most interesting to me is that they're going to bomb, and it's almost absolutely certain it's going to go through, bomb ISIS in Syria until July. And then in July, they will be pulling out of both Syria and Iraq, and Belgium will take over. And I'm like, how do you plan this sort of thing? Yeah. You know, but that's the plan. We'll bomb until July. I mean, so that's pretty telling, people. That's pretty telling. That, and that's just the Netherlands, where the U.S. is planning, I think 2020 or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it partakes of the old fallacy that wars can be turned on and off at will, and again and again people find out that they just can't.
But it still makes a big difference, it seems to me, when in the discussion of these matters, as to whether we're comfortable with the administration's explanation that it's killing people around the world in order to fight terrorism, or whether we think, on the contrary, the administration is committing terrorism around the world, and indeed Mr. Obama should be in a cell in The Hague awaiting trial for war crimes. I think the latter is true, but the former is not even really discussed. It's simply taken for granted. And so we don't notice this American policy, which is not obviously limited to the Obama administration. It represents American foreign policy literally for generations. This policy, which continues to be remarkably belligerent, to risk even, as Karen was pointing out, even nuclear war, and it's taken for granted. We simply do that. We talk about what the Obama administration is doing in its provocations against Russia in Europe or in Ukraine, and we don't really notice that the issue isn't even part of our political discussion, in that you think it might be a matter of some debate amongst the candidates. It's not. They all agree on this.
Right.
Here's Mrs. Clinton, for example, talking about Russia. I remain convinced, this is Hillary Clinton a few months ago, I remain convinced we need a concerted effort to really up the costs on Russia, and in particular on Putin. I am in the category of people who want us to do more in response to the annexation of Crimea and the continuing destabilization of Ukraine. This is astonishing. We all wish Putin would choose to modernize his country. That's an interesting verb.
Right.
What do you mean by that? To modernize his country and move toward the West, instead of sinking himself into historical roots of Tsar-like, Tsar, Caesar, T-S-A-R, Tsar-like behavior and intimidation along national borders and projecting Russian power in places like Syria and elsewhere. I think Russia's objectives are to stymie and to control and undermine American power whenever and wherever they can. I don't think there's much to be surprised about them, close quote. That's Mrs. Clinton. Now, supposedly, our elections are debates about policies. What policies is the new president going to follow? What policies are the American people going to approve in the political parties that offer different policies? But of course, on matters like this, and most major foreign policy matters, on matters that could lead to nuclear war, there is no difference. They don't disagree, with the possible exception of saying who's going to be tougher.
Right.
Who's going to be more belligerent in stopping Russian aggression? Now, an adequate account of what's actually going on here is absent, for the most part, in American political discussion. This is very serious.
Oh, Carl, you're absolutely correct on that. I mean, Michael, do you have any thoughts on American focus regarding the elections? I know you've been out of the country recently. You've been fortunate enough to miss it, but
there's been a little bit of laughter, of course, in Europe, how a candidate like yeah.
There's been some here too.
Yeah. How a candidate like Donald Trump can even make it to a stage where, contradicting himself continuously, he still maintains support by such large numbers of people.
yeah, it's pretty pathetic, isn't it?
Well, his main tactic has been insulting people. And
Right.
Unfortunately, a lot of people, apparently in the American populace, who really like that. Like to see the high and mighty
It's the best thing about him, I think.
introduced.
Probably
yeah.
the best thing about him, yeah. Yeah.
And demonization goes on everywhere.
There is a peculiar thing happening there, though, that both Trump and Cruz, once Mrs. Clinton embraced the neocon position, and at least by implication said the only problem with the neocon position is that Obama isn't strong enough on it. You know, once that happened, both Trump and Cruz, who aren't stupid after all, attacked the neocons, attacked the pro-war party. Now, you wonder how serious they are and how much difference it makes, but they did do that. And for a moment, I thought maybe there was a glimmer of hope here. Maybe we would have a debate about American war policy.
Yeah.
And then I heard the establishment candidate Marco Rubio say, and I'm quoting, "As soon as I take office, I will move quickly to increase pressure on Moscow. Under my administration, there will be no pleadings for meetings with Vladimir Putin. He will be treated for what he is, a gangster and a thug," close quote.
Right, right.
Now that's the that's the Republican position.
I wanted to add something about concerning the definition of terrorism and the perspective that we have here. So,
Please.
According to numbers from the Global Terrorism Database maintained by START, 3,500 deaths and injuries are attributable to Islamist actions, but also 983 are attributable to right-wing terrorism, which oftentimes gets neglected in discussions and
Yeah.
Is this worldwide?
This is concerning the U.S. And,
Just the US,
and
okay.
one major incident regarding right-wing
Right.
terrorism was the Oklahoma City bombing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
One source
yeah.
says that statistically, within the USA, you are 9 times more likely to be killed by a policeman than by a terrorist.
Yeah. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has frequently pointed out that the right-wing terrorist groups have, within domestic, have been more violent than anything coming from, say, the left, or although the police have now taken over, you're right. But that's due to our militarization of the police, I would think. But I'm not absolutely certain because we know the police have been pretty violent towards black society for a long time.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 5th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware, for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bly, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.